Since the end of the First World War, the post train has carried letters and packages across the island of Sodor. Henry or Bear usually bring the mail train from the mainland, which is then shunted for Oliver, Thomas and Percy to take along the branch lines. Usually, the Farquhar branch mail runs are handled by Percy, and they're his favourite trains to take. He enjoys seeing the branch line wake up around him as the sun rises over Sodor, and he finds it relaxing. However, in recent months, post trains have been getting shorter and the loads lighter. Although none of the engines really talk about this, they all know what this means. One evening, Percy, Thomas and Oliver were waiting to take their mail runs as usual. Henry wasn't due in from the mainland for a little while yet.
How are things going on the Wildnorwester, Oliver?
To be honest, Thomas, not that well. We've been having some trouble with the trucks.
Oh? What sort of trouble?
They're playing their tricks a lot more often, and forcefully than usual.
Before Thomas could reply, a whistle drifted through the air.
That sounds like Henry.
Henry? That couldn't be him. He's not due for another 10 minutes or so.
But Thomas was wrong. That whistle was indeed Henry's. As the green engine steamed into the yard, the tank engines could see why he had arrived so early. To their bemusement, Henry's train had only 3 mail vans in it.
Henry, did you forget some of your train?
No, there were only 6 vans waiting at Barrow.
Only 6?
That's right. After leaving one each at Vickerstown, Kelstock Road and Kildare, there's only one for each of you.
Are you sure that's correct?
Oh yes, I checked with Caden before I left Barrow, but those were the only mail vans he had in all day.
Henry explained. He'd been just as surprised as the tank engines, but the Barrow pilot had confirmed it. The 3 tank engines exchanged a look.
Well, I suppose we better get to work then.
The 3 tank engines departed a short while later on each of their runs. They made good time, as there wasn't that much to unload at each station. But there was also a second, more disturbing reason for this, which Percy couldn't help noticing. On every post run, over the decades in which he'd been taking them, they had stopped at every station to unload letters and packages. But this time, there were a few stations at which they didn't stop at all. It was the same story the next night, when Bear brought the mail down from the mainland. This time, as he departed, Percy couldn't help feeling rather worried. It was pretty clear that the post train's days were numbered. A few evenings later, the 3 tank engines were in the yard at Tidmouth. The Fat Controller had wanted to meet with them, and had adjusted their schedules accordingly.
Thomas, Percy and Oliver, as you already know, the post trains aren't carrying as much as they used to.
That's one way of putting it, Ma'am.
Unfortunately, this means the railway can no longer afford to run dedicated mail runs.
But what about the mail? People will still need to have their letters and parcels delivered.
Don't worry, Percy. We'll still be delivering mail. It's just going to be done a little differently.
What do you mean, Mom?
I've arranged for 1 post van to be assigned to each branch line, and a pool of 4 has been set aside for the main line. They'll be run at the head end of passenger trains, as needed.
I see. That makes sense.
You'll be able to sleep in a bit tomorrow, Percy.
I suppose I will.
Percy hadn't even thought of that. Sure enough, Percy was still asleep at 6:30 the next morning, when the firelighter arrived to start his fire. "Morning, Percy! Time to wake up!"
What? Is it 11? It's daylight! The mail train! I'm going to be late!
It's alright, Percy. The mail trains aren't running anymore, remember?
Huh? Oh, yes, of course. Silly me.
A moment later, Percy's driver strode up.
So what do we have first, then?
"We've got some trucks to deliver to Farquhar, and Mavis will have some stone for us to bring back."
Righto, driver. You'd better get going.
Percy departed a few minutes later, chuckling to himself about his brief moment of confusion. He could only imagine what Thomas would say if he found out about it. Percy made good time along the branch line, but he soon became aware of something strange. It wasn't something he could put his buffer on, but he just had a vague feeling of something missing. Percy soon reached a goods station and stopped to deliver 2 crates from one of his vans. He found the station master waiting. "Good morning, Percy."
Morning, John.
Percy replied warmly. He knew the station master here well, from his morning mail stops. You know, I thought I'd missed you this morning.
Really? I thought Ms. Hack notified everyone.
Oh, she did, but my internet connection was down. I couldn't get my email until after you had due past. The station master chuckled. I guess I'll have to drink my morning coffee on my own from now on.
I suppose so,
Percy replied. A few minutes later, the crates had been unloaded. As Percy departed, his thoughts turned to what the station master had said. Maybe that was what that vague feeling had been about, he thought. He'd just missed his usual dawn run. That was something to which he'd have to become accustomed, he supposed. Early the next morning, Thomas was waiting at Dryor, and he was growing impatient. He should have departed a few minutes ago, but the single-track section of the line ahead wasn't clear.
What's keeping Percy? He should have passed through by now. About time,
Thomas grumbled as Percy came into view. A moment later, Percy passed through the station. He was running at the speed limit and looking rather flustered.
Sorry for the delay, Thomas. Had some trouble getting started this morning.
With that, Percy was gone before Thomas could reply. Thomas glanced back, his annoyance replaced by concern.
That's not like Percy.
What do you mean?
Annie asked.
I mean, he's usually got a good reason when he's late. Getting stuck in a flood or trouble with the trucks. But something like trouble getting started, well that's not him.
I see what you mean, but every engine can have a bad morning, Thomas.
That's true, I suppose.
Annie did have a point, Thomas thought, but all the same, he couldn't help feeling a little worried. Over the next couple of days, it became clear that Thomas's worries were justified. On Percy's morning runs, usually the first one or two, he would run late and sometimes be a bit disoriented. One morning, 4 days after Percy's problems had started, he arrived at a Nova quarry, flustered and behind schedule.
Trouble getting started, Percy?
I got here as soon as I could, Mavis.
Mavis, don't you need to shunt the trucks Percy needs to take back?
Oh, yeah.
As Mavis moved off to fetch the trucks, Thomas looked closely at Percy.
Percy, are you alright?
Yes, I'm alright. Why?
We're getting a little worried about you, Percy. These last few mornings, well...
It's just a change in routine, Thomas. I mean, since the post trains were cancelled. I've just got to adjust, that's all.
I see. Well, if there's anything I can do to help...
Thanks, Thomas.
Thomas departed a few minutes later, still a bit concerned. He'd had the same change in routine himself, yet he hadn't had any trouble getting started in the mornings at all. A short while later, Percy was returning from the quarry with his trucks. He was also rather perturbed. He was aware that he'd had trouble getting started in the mornings, now that the post trains weren't running, and he'd expected he would have to adjust. But now that his friends were worried, well...
You look worried, Percy. Penny for your thoughts?
Toby asked, jolting the green tank engine out of his contemplation. Percy explained about his conversation with Thomas.
So that's the thing, Toby. It's just a small change in routine, and I thought I'd have adjusted by now.
Percy, may I say something?
Both Toby and Percy looked over to see Lily waiting at the passenger station. She had arrived while Percy had been talking.
By all means, Lily.
Speaking from my own experience, it can take a while to get used to some changes. Although I have been back in service for 2 years, there are still some things to which I need to adjust.
I thought you seemed to be doing all right, Lily.
It's mostly small things. For instance, I still cannot fathom if Daisy is meant to be a coach or a locomotive. Then there is the manner of dress of some of our passengers, for instance, or this planking pastime.
I don't think any of us get that last one, Lily.
I take your point, Lily, but I'm usually quite good with changes. I mean, I had no trouble adjusting to the new schedule when you started running on our branch.
Percy glanced from Lily to Toby, and back again.
I'm also easily able to cover for either of you, Daisy or Thomas, if you need to go to the works.
That is true.
Then, Percy, do you think the post train may have meant something more to you?
Well, I did enjoy the morning runs. You know, seeing people wake up, that sort of thing. As for something more, I'm not sure if I can answer that, Toby. Thank you, Toby and Lily. You've given me a bit to think about.
With that, the green engine departed. For the rest of the day, Percy did his jobs, as usual, but Toby's question kept coming back to him. It was on his mind all day, and he considered it carefully, trying to come up with a good answer. That evening, the Far Cry branch engines returned to the sheds, after what had been a very busy day for all of them. As Percy stopped in his berth, the other 3 engines looked over.
Evening, Percy.
Evening, Toby. I've been thinking about what you asked me earlier.
What was that?
If the post train may have meant something more to me than it did to you, Thomas. I've been thinking about it, and I've realised something.
What would that be?
Unlike you 3, I don't really have a regular schedule. I mean, Toby starts a day by taking the quarry workers to work, Thomas does a slow passenger run from Elsbridge, and Lily or Daisy did the same thing coming down from Farquhar.
But you've got scheduled goods trains too.
Yes, but I also have extras on top of that, depending on how busy the quarry is, how productive they are at dairy or Tory wreck, and so on. As such, my schedule varies from day to day, and I don't usually start around the same time each day.
But how does this relate to the post trains?
Well, those were the only regular train I had. Each night at 11:30, I'd head down to Knapford Harbour with you, and we'd take the mail runs. By the time they finished, it was time to start the day's work.
Ah, I see.
That does make sense.
Percy, if it helps, you could take my first passenger train in the mornings. And E. Clarabelle won't mind.
Percy considered Thomas's offer.
Thank you, Thomas, but that may be just moving the problem further down the track. No pun intended. I mean, if that run was changed or cancelled too.
So what do you want to do, Percy?
Maybe... Thomas, when the firelighter gets your fire going in the morning, could you ask him to do mine as well? That'll give me a chance to wake up and be ready as needed.
Of course, Percy.
Thomas replied, happy to be able to help his old friend. Early the next morning, the firelighter arrived to get Thomas's fire going, and he got Percy up and steaming too. When the green engine's driver arrived, half an hour later, he was ready to go and headed out on time. As he headed over to pick up his trucks, Percy was smiling. Are you used to the new routine, Percy?
More or less, driver.
Percy replied, and he explained about the conversation in the sheds last night. When he'd finished, his driver chuckled. Well, I'm glad you've got it sorted.
So am I, driver. So am I.
Percy replied. With that, he and his crew set to work. As usual, they'd have a busy day ahead, and now they were ready for it.